coach made your entire team quit in one practice. Coach Brennan locked us in the gym during tornado sirens because champions don't stop for weather. We were at regionals warm-ups when the first siren went off. The sky had that sick green color that makes your stomach drop. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Tornado warning. Seek shelter immediately. Everyone started moving toward the locker rooms where the shelter area was. Coach Brennan blew his whistle so hard spit flew out. Nobody moves! We have 20 minutes before game time. Coach, that's a tornado siren. James, our captain, said carefully. I don't care if it's the apocalypse. We're playing this game. He walked over to the gym doors and turned his key in the lock. State championships don't get rescheduled for rain. Through the high windows, we could see debris starting to fly past. Tree branches, a stop sign. The assistant coach reached for the door. Coach Brennan blocked him. You open that door, you're fired, and these kids forfeit the season. My phone rang. It was my dad. Coach snatched it from my hand before I could answer. No phones during practice. You know the rules, Clay. My little brother's daycare is in the tornado path. I was shaking. They're evacuating to the basement. I need to know if he's okay. He'll be fine. Your job is to focus on this game. That's when we heard it. That sound everyone says is like a freight train. It wasn't. It was worse. Like the world was being torn apart. The windows started rattling violently. Lily, our youngest player at 14, started crying. Please, my mom's alone. She's in a wheelchair. She can't get to the basement by herself. Then she should have planned better. Coach was actually smiling. This is what separates winners from quitters. The lights flickered. Through the window, we saw a car flip in the parking lot. Our assistant coach pulled out his phone. I'm calling 911. Coach Brennan grabbed the phone and threw it against the wall, shattering it. Anyone else want to test me? That's when Danny stood up. His house was in a trailer park, right in the tornado's projected path. His whole family was there. Grandparents, baby sister, everyone. Coach, please. My family lives in Meadowbrook. That's directly... I don't care if your family lives in a cardboard box. Sit down. The building shook. Actually shook. A window cracked. We could hear things hitting the roof. Maria, who never talked back to anyone, stood up. My dad's a storm chaser. He texted me. This is an F3 at minimum. The gym roof isn't rated for that. Well, then you better hope it holds, Coach said. But for the first time, he looked uncertain. My phone, still in his hand, lit up with texts. Even from across the room, I could see basement now from my mom. Destroyed from someone. Are you safe? From another. James, our 6'4" captain who'd never challenged Coach once in 4 years, walked straight up to him. Give her the phone. You backing down from states, Captain? Your scholarship? Give her the phone. The stare down lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the skylight exploded. Glass and rain poured down. We all screamed, diving under bleachers. When I looked up, Coach Brennan was white as paper, still standing in the open like an idiot. That's when tiny Lily did it. While Coach was frozen, she grabbed his keys from his pocket and ran for the door. He snapped out of it, lunging for her, but Maria and 3 other girls formed a wall. You want to die here? Fine. We're leaving. Lily got the door open. We could see down the hall to the shelter area where other teams were already hunkered down. But between us and safety was a wall of windows. And through them, we could see the tornado. It was massive. Black. Maybe 3 blocks away. If we run now? James started. Now! I screamed. We ran. All of us except Coach. Even the assistant coach. The hallway windows exploded behind us as we dove into the shelter. We made it with maybe 10 seconds to spare before the whole world went crazy. The sound was indescribable. Like being inside a giant scream. When it was over, we emerged to find the gym destroyed. The roof was gone. The court where we'd been standing was buried under debris. Coach Brennan was found in a supply closet, uninjured but catatonic with fear. Danny's family survived in their community shelter. Lily's mom had neighbors who carried her to safety. My brother was fine, but 7 people in our town didn't make it, including a high school student who'd been caught in their car trying to get home. The next day, all 23 of us officially quit. Every single player. The state athletic board launched an investigation. Coach Brennan was fired, banned from coaching, and charged with 23 counts of reckless endangerment. At his hearing, Lily's mom rolled up in her wheelchair and said one sentence. He valued a trophy over my child's life. The tornado was rated an F4. It missed the gym by less than 50 yards. If we'd stayed 60 seconds longer, we'd all be dead. But here's what nobody knows yet. Coach Brennan wasn't just obsessed with winning. We found out why he locked that door, and it's so much worse than anyone imagined. 3 days after the tornado, I'm sitting in my destroyed bedroom trying to sort through what's left of my stuff when my phone buzzes with a text in our team group chat. Bailey's message pops up and I almost ignore it because I'm not ready to talk about basketball or coach or any of it. But then I read what she wrote and my hands freeze. She says Coach Brennan's wife left him 2 months before the tournament, and nobody on the team knew he was going through a divorce. I stare at my phone screen trying to figure out why this matters when Nina responds that she heard Coach crying in his office late one night during practice, which he never did before this season. The detail feels random, but it sticks in my brain like a splinter. I can't stop thinking about Bailey's text, so I start looking through old team photos on my phone, scrolling back through the season. That's when I realize Coach looked different this year. Thinner, exhausted, dark circles under his eyes that we all just ignored because we were focused on winning. In photos from last year, he looks normal, but this season he looks like he hasn't slept in months. My phone rings and it's James calling me, which is weird because he usually just texts. He admits he'd noticed Coach acting strange for weeks, making reckless decisions in games and snapping at players over tiny mistakes. James sounds guilty, like he should have said something sooner. The next morning, Lily's mom texts asking to meet with several of us at the community center being used for tornado relief. She's been talking to other parents and discovered something that makes my stomach turn. Coach Brennan had been placed on administrative concern status by the athletic director 3 weeks before the tournament for erratic behavior during practice. 3 weeks. They knew something was wrong and let him keep coaching us anyway. We gather at the community center, and it's me, James, Lily, Danny, Maria, Bailey, and Nina, sitting in folding chairs while Lily's mom pulls up emails on her laptop. She obtained them through a parent records request, and they're brutal to read. Coach had been warned twice about inappropriate intensity with players, including one incident where he made a freshman run sprints until she vomited. The emails use careful language like concerning behavior and requires monitoring, but what they really mean is this guy is losing it and we're watching him fall apart. Danny suggests we talk to the assistant coach who's been avoiding everyone since the incident. We find him at his apartment in the part of town that didn't get hit by the tornado. He won't open the door at first, but after an hour of us standing in the hallway, he finally lets us in. His apartment smells like old pizza and he looks terrible. After more convincing, he finally admits that Coach Brennan had become obsessed with winning state after losing his previous job at another school under mysterious circumstances. The assistant coach tells us Coach had been fired from his last position 3 years ago, but won't say why, just that it was handled quietly, and the school gave him a neutral reference to avoid legal problems. He looks genuinely guilty as he explains he should have reported Coach's behavior, but was afraid of losing his own job. I'm walking out of the apartment building when a woman approaches me in the parking lot. She introduces herself as Faith Wyatt, a local journalist covering the tornado aftermath, and says she's been investigating Coach Brennan's background for a separate story. She's discovered he was fired from 2 previous coaching positions, not just one, and both terminations were sealed with non-disclosure agreements. Faith shares copies of public records she printed out showing Coach Brennan had been coaching for 15 years at 4 different schools, never staying longer than 3 years anywhere. Each departure was listed as mutual agreement or pursuing other opportunities, which Faith says is code for forced resignation. I convince Faith to let our team help with the investigation, since we're the ones who nearly died, and she agrees to share what she finds if we share our discoveries. We split up assignments right there in the parking lot. Bailey and Nina will talk to former players, Danny will research the school's athletic records, and I'll try to access Coach's personal office before it's cleaned out. 2 days later, I sneak into the temporary athletic offices set up in the undamaged elementary school with James as lookout. Coach's boxes are sitting there in the hallway waiting to be shipped to him, and I find a folder labeled Performance Reviews that he apparently kept copies of despite being told to destroy them. The first review I open is from 8 years ago at Lincoln High. The words jump out at me. Coach Brennan displays concerning inability to accept loss and disproportionate emotional investment in student outcomes. I flip through more pages. Every school wrote basically the same thing. At Roosevelt Academy, someone noted he became increasingly aggressive during tournament play. At Westfield Prep, they wrote unstable behavior when facing elimination scenarios. The pattern is right there in black and white, and every single school saw it but just passed him along to the next place. I take photos of every page with my phone before James hisses that someone's coming down the hall. We shove everything back in the boxes and slip out through the side door. That night, Bailey texts the group chat that she and Nina found 3 former players through social media. All 3 girls described the same experience of Coach losing control during big games. One of them, Melanie Sutton, actually agrees to talk to us on video chat. We set it up for the next evening, and I can barely sleep thinking about what she might tell us. When we finally get on the call, Melanie looks older than she probably is, like someone who's been through something bad. She doesn't waste time with small talk. 6 years ago, her team was playing in the state championship game and losing badly at halftime. Coach Brennan locked them in the locker room and wouldn't let anyone leave. He stood in front of the door and told them they couldn't come out until they committed to winning. Her voice shakes a little when she describes how they could hear the second half starting without them, how parents were banging on the door, how Coach just kept saying they were quitters who didn't deserve to play. Finally, some of the bigger girls on the team literally broke down the door. The school covered the whole thing up because they were scared of bad publicity. Melanie quit basketball that day and never played again. After we hang up, nobody says anything for a long time. Danny breaks the silence by sharing what he found while digging through old sports records online. Coach's teams always had amazing regular season records like 20 wins and 2 losses, stuff like that. But then tournament time would come and they'd fall apart. In 15 years of coaching, he made it to state finals 4 times and lost every single time. The losses got worse each time too. The first final, they lost by 3 points. The last one before our school, they lost by 30. It's like the pressure kept building and he kept getting more desperate. We're sitting at Maria's house the next day comparing all our notes when her dad walks through the living room. He's this big guy with a weather service jacket, and he stops when he sees us surrounded by papers and laptops. He asks what we're working on. Maria tries to brush him off, but he keeps pushing. So finally she tells him we're trying to understand why Coach did what he did. Her dad goes completely quiet. His face changes. Then he sits down and tells us something that makes the whole room freeze. He was at the regional tournament that day as a volunteer weather spotter. He personally warned Coach about the tornado 30 minutes before the sirens even went off. I feel sick to my stomach. Maria's dad pulls out his phone and shows us the text messages he sent Coach. There are radar images showing this massive red and purple blob heading straight for the tournament venue. The messages say things like violent tornado forming and immediate evacuation recommended, and this is extremely dangerous. The timestamps show he sent them at 2:47 in the afternoon. The receipts show Coach read them. Read at 2:47. But he never responded, never took any action, just read the warnings and decided to ignore them. James punches Maria's wall and immediately starts apologizing. But we all get it. We're all feeling the same thing. This wasn't Coach panicking in the moment or making a split-second bad choice. He had 30 minutes of advance warning. He could have evacuated us safely, calmly, with plenty of time. Instead, he made a choice. A calculated choice to risk our lives rather than forfeit the game. That night, Faith calls me. She sounds excited, but also kind of scared. She found someone at Coach's previous school who gave her information about his daughter. Apparently, she was 17, and a star player on a team he coached 10 years ago. She quit basketball her senior year right after a terrible state championship loss. The source won't say more without legal protection, but they hint there's a bigger story there. Something about why she quit. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about Coach having a daughter who played for him. What that must have been like. Around 2 in the morning, I give up on sleeping and start searching social media. It takes forever, but I finally find her profile. Her bio says, former athlete. Some things aren't worth it. I scroll through her photos. The ones from 10 years ago show this girl who looks empty somehow, like someone took something important from her. But the recent photos show someone different, happier, like she finally got away from whatever was hurting her. The next day, Bailey says maybe we should stop. Maybe we're getting too deep into this and should just let the criminal case handle it. But Lily argues back. She says we deserve to understand why someone we trusted nearly killed us. The team is splitting. Half of us want to keep digging for answers. The other half just want to move on and forget it ever happened. Nobody's really wrong. We're just processing this differently. The school announces the meeting through a mass email 2 days later. Christopher Lane wants all team members and parents at the community center Thursday night to discuss moving forward. The email uses words like healing and support and resources, but nothing about accountability or investigation. My mom reads it at breakfast and her jaw gets tight. She knows what I know. They're trying to control the narrative before we can. Thursday arrives and the community center parking lot is packed. Inside, they've set up rows of folding chairs facing a table where Christopher sits with the school superintendent and 2 school board members. Grief counselors stand along the back wall holding pamphlets. The whole setup feels staged, like they practiced how to look concerned without actually being concerned. Christopher starts talking about trauma and recovery and the importance of community healing. He mentions counseling services available through the school. He talks about how Coach's actions don't reflect the values of our athletic program. But when Lily's mom raises her hand and asks what the school knew about Coach's history before hiring him, Christopher's face does this weird thing where his smile stays, but his eyes go flat. He says all standard hiring procedures were followed, and they're conducting an internal review. Lily's mom tries to follow up, but he moves to the next question before she can speak again. James's dad asks if the school verified Coach's references from previous positions. Christopher says yes, absolutely. All references checked out satisfactorily. But his hand shakes slightly when he reaches for his water glass, and I notice he won't make eye contact with anyone in the front row. The meeting continues like that for 40 minutes with Christopher deflecting every real question behind walls of corporate language and vague promises of review processes. When he finally ends the meeting, half the parents are visibly angry, and the other half look confused about why they bothered coming. I wait until most people leave before approaching Christopher at the table where he's gathering papers. My mom stays back but watches from 10 feet away. I ask him directly why he hired someone who'd been fired from 2 previous schools. Christopher stops organizing papers and looks at me with this expression that's trying to be sympathetic, but mostly seems annoyed. He tells me that's not accurate information, and I shouldn't believe everything I hear. I mention that Faith found public records showing the terminations. His face changes then, going from annoyed to something harder. He says those were mutual departures, not firings, and all his references checked out perfectly fine. But his voice has this edge now that wasn't there before. I push harder and ask if he actually called the references or just accepted written letters. Christopher's neck gets red and he starts saying something about proper procedures and legal requirements. But he's talking faster now and his hands are moving too much. My mom steps closer and asks to see the reference letters. Christopher says those are personnel documents and not available to the public. The way he says it sounds final, like he's been waiting to use that line. But watching his face, the way his eyes keep darting to the door like he wants to escape, I know he's lying about how much he actually investigated before hiring Coach. He knew something was wrong and hired him anyway, because winning teams look good for athletic directors who want to move up to bigger schools. Nina finds me in the parking lot after and says her mom wants to help. Nina's mom works as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, and she knows how to file Freedom of Information requests for public documents. She explains we can request Coach's hiring documents, his personnel file, and any complaints filed against him through the school district. It'll take weeks to get responses because government agencies always drag their feet on these things, but it's official action, and they have to respond eventually. We drive to Nina's house, and her mom has forms already printed out. She helps us fill in the specific document requests, being careful about the legal language so the school can't reject them on technicalities. We request all employment applications, reference letters, background checks, personnel evaluations, and any disciplinary records for Coach from the past 3 years. We also request all communications between Christopher and Coach's previous employers. Nina's mom makes copies of everything, and we mail them certified mail so there's proof of delivery. She warns us that the school will probably redact a lot of information claiming privacy exemptions, but even redacted documents can tell us something by what they choose to hide. Walking out of the post office after mailing the requests feels like we're finally doing something real instead of just talking about it. 2 days later, I get an email from Melanie. The subject line just says, "If this helps," and there's a PDF attached. I open it and start reading, and my stomach drops. It's 10 pages of detailed incidents from Coach's time at her school. Melanie documented everything with dates and witnesses. She describes how Coach grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises when she missed a free throw in practice, how he threw a basketball at another player's head during a timeout, how he screamed at their assistant coach until the guy quit mid-season. The worst one is from their conference championship game when they were losing by 12 points at halftime. Coach locked the locker room door from the inside and wouldn't let anyone leave. He stood there blocking the door, telling them they were worthless and weak and didn't deserve to wear the uniform. Melanie says they finally got out when their team captain threatened to call 911, and Coach backed down. But the school never reported it. They just quietly moved him along with a neutral reference letter. Reading Melanie's document makes me physically sick, because every incident she describes is a warning sign that got ignored. If her school had reported Coach properly, he never would have been hired at ours. We never would have been locked in that gym during the tornado. Those 7 people who died might still be alive. The document includes something else that makes everything click into place. Melanie writes that Coach had been seeing a sports psychologist at their school named Dr. Gomez, who was brought in after the locker room incident. Dr. Gomez met with Coach for 6 sessions and documented serious concerns in reports that went to the athletic director. The psychologist wrote about Coach's pathological fear of failure and how he was transferring personal trauma onto team performance. Dr. Gomez specifically recommended Coach take a leave of absence and get intensive therapy before continuing to work with students. But the school ignored the recommendation because they were in the middle of tournament season and didn't want to disrupt the team. They waited until after state finals to force Coach out, and even then they gave him that neutral reference instead of reporting the safety concerns. Melanie attached copies of Dr. Gomez's reports with some parts blacked out for privacy. But what's visible is damning. Dr. Gomez wrote that Coach showed signs of becoming dangerous when faced with failure scenarios and recommended immediate intervention. The school had professional documentation that Coach was a threat to students, and they did nothing except pass him to the next school. I forward Melanie's document to Faith immediately, and she calls me within an hour. She's already tracking down Dr. Gomez using her journalist databases. It takes her 3 days, but she finds an address in Arizona where Dr. Gomez retired 2 years ago. Faith calls and Dr. Gomez refuses to talk at first, citing patient confidentiality and professional ethics. But Faith is persistent and explains that we're not asking about specific patient details. We're trying to understand a pattern of behavior that's now resulted in criminal charges and endangered 24 teenagers. She tells Dr. Gomez about the tornado and the lockdown and the 7 deaths in our town. There's a long silence on the phone, and then Dr. Gomez says she'll think about it. Faith calls back the next day, and this time Dr. Gomez agrees to speak generally about the psychology of coaching obsession, without naming Coach specifically. They arrange a video call and Faith invites me to join. Dr. Gomez looks exactly like I imagined a retired sports psychologist would look, with gray hair and kind eyes and this calm way of speaking that probably helped athletes feel safe. She starts by explaining that some coaches develop what she calls pathological winning obsession, where they internalize their team's losses as personal failures. For these coaches, losing isn't just disappointing, it's existentially threatening, because their entire sense of self-worth is tied to winning. Dr. Gomez says these coaches will take increasingly dangerous risks to avoid experiencing failure, because failure feels like dying. They stop seeing players as people, and start seeing them as extensions of themselves, as tools to prevent the unbearable feeling of inadequacy. The dangerous part is when these coaches hit a pattern of near success, followed by devastating losses. Each loss reinforces their fear and makes them more desperate, which leads to more extreme behavior in the next high-stakes situation. Dr. Gomez describes it as a spiral where the coach becomes less rational and more driven by panic each time they face potential failure. She never says Coach's name, but everything she describes matches exactly what happened to us in that gym. Coach wasn't thinking rationally when he locked those doors. He was in full panic mode, choosing potential death over the certainty of forfeiting and losing his last chance at a state championship. The FOIA responses arrive 5 weeks after we filed them. The envelope is thick, but when I open it, my excitement dies. Coach's hiring documents are there, but his personnel file is maybe 40% blacked out with thick black marker. Entire pages are just solid black rectangles with maybe 1 or 2 words visible. What we can read shows that Christopher did receive reference letters from Coach's previous schools. 2 of them are glowing, talking about Coach's dedication, an impressive win record, and strong leadership. But there's a 3rd letter that's different. It's from a principal at one of the earlier schools, and even with some parts redacted, you can tell it's negative. The visible parts mention intensity issues and concerns about emotional regulation, and a suggestion that Coach might benefit from additional professional development. The letter recommends calling for more details before making a hiring decision. But there's no record of Christopher ever making that call. Instead, there's a note in Christopher's handwriting at the bottom of the page that just says, "Win record speaks for itself. Need to improve program." He saw the warning signs and hired Coach anyway because he wanted someone who could win games and make the athletic program look good. Christopher sacrificed our safety for his own career advancement. Danny texts the group chat late one night with a link to a newspaper archive. He's been going through old papers from the town where Coach used to live, looking for anything about his daughter. What he finds is from 10 years ago, a brief article about a high school basketball player being hospitalized during the state championship game. The article doesn't give many details, just says the player suffered from severe dehydration and exhaustion and was taken to the hospital as a precaution. The player's name is mentioned once, and it's Coach's daughter. The article says she was a senior and a team captain, and her team lost the championship after she had to leave the game. The whole thing is written in that careful way newspapers use when they're not saying everything they know. Danny also finds the box score from that game, and Coach's daughter had played 47 out of 48 minutes, which is insane for a high school game. The article mentions the temperature in the gym was over 90 degrees, and several spectators had to leave due to heat. But it never questions why a coach left his daughter in the game for that long in those conditions. Faith uses her media connections to track down the emergency room doctor who treated Coach's daughter that night. It takes multiple calls and some convincing, but the doctor finally agrees to talk off the record. He won't give specific patient details, but he confirms that the girl's condition was consistent with prolonged physical stress and inadequate rest. He says her electrolyte levels were dangerously low, and she showed signs of chronic overtraining. When Faith asks if this seemed like a one-time incident or a pattern, the doctor goes quiet for a long time before saying that in his medical opinion, you don't get that depleted from one game. That kind of physical breakdown happens when someone has been pushed too hard for too long without proper recovery. He remembers the case specifically because the father initially refused to leave the exam room and kept asking when his daughter could return to playing. The doctor had to get hospital security involved before the father would step out and let them treat her properly. After Faith hangs up, she looks at me through the video call, and neither of us says anything for a minute because we're both thinking the same thing. Coach didn't just risk our lives during the tornado. He'd been destroying people he supposedly cared about for years, and every institution that should have stopped him just looked the other way. Faith spent 3 days tracking down Coach's ex-wife through coaching networks and mutual contacts. The first 2 people she called hung up immediately when they heard what the investigation was about. The third person gave her a phone number, but warned that the ex-wife had refused to talk to anyone about her marriage for years. Faith called the number 5 times over 2 days before anyone answered. When someone finally picked up, Faith explained who she was and what had happened during the tornado. The line went silent for so long that Faith thought the call had dropped. Then the ex-wife said she needed time to think about it. 2 days later, she texted Faith an address for a coffee shop 2 towns over, and said she would only meet with Faith and one team member, nobody else. Faith called me because I'd been helping with the investigation from the start. We drove to the coffee shop on a gray afternoon with rain threatening. The place was nearly empty, just us and an elderly couple in the corner. The ex-wife was already sitting at a back table when we arrived. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. Her hair was pulled back tight, and she had dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She didn't smile when we sat down. Faith started to introduce herself, but the ex-wife cut her off. Her first words were direct and sad. She said she'd tried to warn people, but nobody wanted to listen. Faith pulled out her notebook, and the ex-wife immediately shook her head. No recording devices, no notes during the conversation. Faith could write everything down afterward, but not while they were talking. We agreed, and Faith put the notebook away. The ex-wife asked us not to use her name in anything we published. She had a daughter to protect, and using her name would make her daughter identifiable. Then she started talking and didn't stop for almost an hour. She said her husband's obsession with winning had destroyed their marriage and nearly destroyed their daughter. It wasn't always that bad. When they first got married, basketball was just his job, something he enjoyed and was good at. But over the years, it became something else entirely. Every loss felt personal to him, like a reflection of his worth as a person. She watched him change slowly, season by season, until she barely recognized the man she'd married. During tournament season, he became someone different. He couldn't sleep, lying awake replaying games in his head. He stopped eating regular meals, just grabbing food whenever he remembered. He was convinced that winning state would somehow fix everything wrong in his life. He told her once that a state championship would prove he wasn't a failure, that all the sacrifices had been worth it. She didn't understand what sacrifices he meant, because coaching was his choice, his passion. But he talked about it like he'd given up everything for basketball and needed that trophy to justify it all. The ex-wife's voice got quieter when she started talking about their daughter. She took a sip of her coffee and her hand shook slightly. Their daughter had been a talented player, really talented. Coach started training her separately at home when she was in middle school. Extra drills in the driveway before school. Weekend practices that lasted hours. The ex-wife thought it was good at first, a father and daughter bonding over a shared interest. But by the time their daughter reached high school, it had become something darker. Coach was running additional practices before dawn, making their daughter wake up at 5 in the morning to train before school started. He gave her caffeine pills to boost her performance during games. The ex-wife found the pills in their daughter's gym bag and confronted him. He said every serious athlete used them, that it was normal. She knew it wasn't normal. She knew he was pushing their daughter too hard, but she didn't know how to stop him without destroying their family. The breaking point came during the state championship game 10 years ago. Their daughter had been playing incredible basketball all season. The team made it to the finals and everyone was excited. But during the championship game, something went wrong. It was hot in the gym, over 90 degrees. Their daughter had been playing almost the entire game without rest. The ex-wife was sitting in the stands watching, and she could see her daughter struggling. She looked pale and unsteady on her feet. The ex-wife wanted to go down and tell coach to take her out, but other parents said she was being overprotective, that their daughter was fine. Then their daughter collapsed on the court, just fell down mid-play and didn't get up. The ex-wife ran down from the stands. Paramedics were already there, checking their daughter's vital signs. She was conscious but confused, not sure where she was. The paramedics said she needed to go to the hospital immediately. That's when coach did something the ex-wife would never forgive. He told the paramedics to wait. He said their daughter could push through it, that she just needed water and a few minutes rest. He actually argued with the paramedics while their daughter was lying on the floor. The ex-wife had to physically push him aside and tell the paramedics to take her daughter to the hospital. At the emergency room, doctors said their daughter was severely dehydrated, and her electrolyte levels were dangerous. She showed signs of chronic overtraining and physical stress that had been building for months. The doctor told them that this kind of breakdown didn't happen from one game. It happened when someone had been pushed too hard for too long without proper recovery. The ex-wife sat in that hospital room watching her daughter sleep with an IV in her arm, and she realized her husband was dangerous. He had chosen basketball over their daughter's health. He had valued winning more than their child's safety. She filed for divorce 3 months later. The custody battle was ugly. Coach threatened to fight for full custody if she told anyone the real reason for the divorce. She couldn't risk losing her daughter completely, so she stayed quiet about the details. The divorce papers just said irreconcilable differences. She got primary custody, and coach got supervised visitation that he rarely used. I asked why she'd left him 2 months before our tournament if they'd been divorced for years. The ex-wife started crying then, quiet tears that she wiped away quickly. She said she'd heard through coaching networks that he was becoming unstable again. Other coaches were talking about his behavior at games, the way he screamed at referees and his own players. Someone told her he'd been placed on administrative concern status at our school. She tried to reach out to him, tried to convince him to quit coaching before he hurt someone. They met for coffee and she told him he needed help, that he was heading toward another breakdown. He refused to listen. He told her this was his last chance to prove he wasn't a failure. Those were his exact words. Last chance. He said if he didn't win state this year, his entire career would have been for nothing. All the years of coaching, all the losses, all the sacrifices would be meaningless without that championship trophy. She tried to explain that his worth as a person wasn't tied to a basketball trophy, but he couldn't hear it. He was too far gone, too deep in his obsession. She left that coffee shop knowing he was going to do something dangerous, and she didn't know how to stop him. She called the school's athletic director and tried to warn him, but he brushed her off, said coach was fine, just intense. 2 months later, the tornado happened. When she heard the news about what he'd done, she wasn't surprised. She was horrified, but not surprised. She knew he'd been heading toward something like this for years, and everyone had just looked the other way. Faith and I sat there processing everything the ex-wife had told us. The revelation that coach knew this was his last chance reframed everything we thought we understood. He wasn't just obsessed with winning in some abstract way. He was desperate to avoid facing the reality that his entire identity was built on something he couldn't achieve. The tornado lockdown wasn't about championship glory or pushing through adversity. It was about a man so scared of failure that he chose potential death over certain loss. He would rather risk killing 23 teenagers than face another tournament elimination. That level of desperation was somehow more disturbing than simple obsession. We thanked the ex-wife for meeting with us, and she made us promise one more time not to use her name. Then she left, and Faith and I sat in that coffee shop for another hour going over everything she'd said. Faith had been taking mental notes the whole time, and now she filled her notebook with every detail she could remember. 3 weeks after the tornado, Faith published her investigation. The article was long and detailed, laying out coach's entire history across 4 schools. She included interviews with former players, the sports psychologist's general comments, and carefully anonymized quotes from the ex-wife. She documented how multiple schools had enabled his dangerous behavior by passing him along quietly, rather than reporting him to state athletic boards. The story exploded beyond our small town within hours of publication. National media picked it up by that evening. News vans showed up at our school the next morning. Reporters were calling everyone involved, trying to get interviews. The focus shifted from just coach's actions during the tornado to the systemic failures that had allowed him to keep coaching for 15 years, despite repeated warning signs. Major sports networks ran segments about the culture of enabling in high school athletics. Education policy experts were writing opinion pieces about the need for better oversight. Our small town became the center of a national conversation about student safety and institutional accountability. Jade Rivas from the school board called an emergency meeting 4 days after Faith's article published. The meeting was held in the community center since the school board office was too small for all the media and concerned parents who showed up. Jade stood at the front of the room looking grim. She announced a full investigation into Christopher Lane's hiring practices and the athletic department's oversight failures. She read from a prepared statement that laid out the timeline of what the school board had known and when they'd known it. Christopher was placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending the investigation's results. He wasn't at the meeting. Jade said he'd been instructed not to have contact with any students or staff members until the investigation concluded. The assistant coach resigned before he could be fired. He submitted his resignation letter that same day, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew the real reason. He'd been complicit in Coach's behavior, staying silent when he should have spoken up. His resignation was accepted without comment. The state athletic board launched its own investigation into all 4 schools that had employed Coach over his 15-year career. They sent investigators to each school to review hiring records, personnel files, and any complaints that had been filed. Within a week, 2 athletic directors and 1 principal were suspended for failing to report concerning behavior and providing false references. The investigation revealed a pattern of schools quietly pushing out problematic coaches by giving them neutral references just to avoid legal liability. Coach would get fired or forced to resign from one school, and that school would give him a decent reference to make him someone else's problem. Nobody wanted to deal with the fallout of officially reporting misconduct, so they just passed him along. It was easier to let him become another school's liability than to do the right thing and flag him in the system. Each school probably thought they were handling an isolated incident, not realizing they were part of a pattern that would eventually put kids in danger. A lawyer named Aditya Schwartz contacted our team a week after the state investigation was announced. He specialized in institutional liability cases and had been following our story in the news. He called me first because my name had been in several articles as one of the team members helping with the investigation. He explained that he wanted to represent our team pro bono in a potential lawsuit against the school district. He said the pattern of enabling Coach's behavior despite known risks created clear grounds for negligence claims. The school district had hired someone with red flags in his history, failed to properly supervise him, ignored warnings about his behavior, and that failure had put us in life-threatening danger. He thought we had a strong case not just against Coach personally, but against the institutional systems that had allowed him to keep coaching. He wanted to meet with our whole team and our parents to discuss the possibility of legal action. I told him I needed to talk to everyone first and get back to him. That night, I sent a message to our group chat explaining what Aditya had said. The responses were mixed. Some families wanted to pursue it, seeing it as a way to force real change and get compensation for therapy costs. Other families were hesitant, worried about the stress of a lawsuit and more publicity. We needed to meet in person and actually discuss this as a team before making any decisions. We scheduled the meeting for Saturday afternoon at Maria's house since her parents had a big basement that could fit everyone. 20 families showed up, which meant most of the team and Aditya came to explain the legal process. He set up a laptop with a presentation but kept it simple, walking us through what a lawsuit would actually mean. The school district had insurance that covered liability claims, and our case was strong because of the pattern of negligence Christopher Lane and the other schools had shown. Some parents started asking questions immediately about how long it would take and whether we'd have to testify, and Aditya answered each one carefully, never making promises he couldn't keep. Then Lily's mom rolled forward in her wheelchair, and everyone got quiet because she didn't usually speak up in big groups. She said hitting the insurance company was the only language the school board understood, that they'd already moved on from what happened to us, and nothing would change unless we forced them to pay attention through their wallets. Her voice shook a little, but she didn't back down, explaining that therapy for Lily was costing hundreds of dollars every week, and their insurance only covered part of it, and other families were probably in the same situation. A few parents nodded, and I could see my mom gripping my dad's hand tight. Then Danny stood up, and the room went even quieter because he'd been so silent through all the previous meetings. He told everyone that his family's trailer was completely destroyed in the tornado, that they'd lost everything except what they were wearing that day. They were staying with his aunt in a 2-bedroom apartment, all 7 of them crammed in there, and his little sister had to sleep on the couch. His grandparents were too old to be living like that, and his mom was working double shifts to try to save money for a new place, but it wasn't enough. He said he needed the settlement money not for therapy or justice, but just to have a home again, and suddenly the lawsuit wasn't abstract anymore. It was about Danny's baby sister sleeping on a couch, and his grandparents sharing a bedroom with his parents. Nobody said anything for a long minute, and then Aditya suggested we take a vote on whether to move forward as a group. He explained that families could opt in or opt out individually, but having everyone together would make the case stronger, and the settlement potentially larger. We did a show of hands, and 17 families voted yes, while 3 voted no. The 3 who opted out were families whose kids hadn't been as involved in the investigation, parents who looked exhausted and said they just couldn't handle more stress or media attention. I understood, but I also felt something crack in our team unity, like we were splitting into those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to forget. The families who opted out left pretty quickly after the vote, and the rest of us stayed to sign initial paperwork with Aditya. 2 days later, the prosecutor handling Coach Brennan's criminal case called me directly, which was weird because she usually went through my parents. She said she wanted to give us a heads up before it hit the news that Coach's defense team was arguing diminished capacity due to mental health crisis. They had evidence that he'd been suffering from severe depression and untreated anxiety for years, and they were pushing for psychiatric treatment instead of jail time. She sounded frustrated, like she thought the defense might actually work, and she wanted us to be prepared for the possibility that Coach might not go to prison at all. I told the team in our group chat, and the responses came fast and angry. Some people were actually relieved, saying it proved Coach wasn't evil, just sick, while others were furious that mental illness was used as an excuse for nearly killing us. Maria wrote a long message about how her uncle had depression, And he never locked anyone in a building during a tornado. So being mentally ill didn't mean you got a free pass for endangering kids. James said he didn't care what Coach's diagnosis was. Actions had consequences regardless of mental state. I sat there reading the messages pile up and realized I felt both things at once. Angry that Coach had put us in danger, but also sad that he'd been suffering and nobody had helped him before it got this bad. The contradiction made my head hurt. I had a therapy appointment with Cecilia Morrow the next day, and I brought up the mental health defense immediately. She listened to me talk for 10 minutes straight about feeling confused and guilty for having sympathy for Coach, and then she said something that helped. She explained that understanding why someone hurt you doesn't mean forgiving them or excusing what they did, and I could hold both truths at the same time without it being contradictory. Coach was suffering, and Coach nearly killed us, and both things were real and valid. She said trauma responses weren't logical, and I didn't have to figure out the right way to feel about him because there wasn't one. I left her office feeling slightly less tangled up inside, but still carrying this heavy weight of complicated emotions I didn't know what to do with. Bailey stopped showing up to our team meetings after that, and she quit responding in the group chat too. After a week of silence, I drove to her house and knocked until her mom answered. Bailey was in her room and didn't want to come out, but her mom convinced her to at least talk to me at the door. She looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes and her hair unwashed, and she admitted she'd been having panic attacks multiple times a day. Every time her phone buzzed with a news alert or group chat message, her chest got tight and she couldn't breathe. She said she was done with the investigation and the lawsuit and all of it. She just wanted to forget the tornado happened and move on with her life. I tried to tell her we needed her, but she shook her head and said, needing answers wasn't the same as being able to handle finding them, and she'd reached her limit. Her mom put a hand on her shoulder and gave me a look that said I should leave, so I did. Driving home, I started wondering if Bailey was right. If maybe I was forcing everyone to relive trauma over and over in the name of finding truth. Some people heal by understanding what happened, and some people heal by creating distance from it, and maybe there wasn't one right way to deal with what Coach did to us. James called me that night and asked if we could talk, his voice sounding rough and tired. We met at the park near school, sitting on swings in the dark like we were kids again. He told me he'd been having nightmares every night since the tornado, always the same dream where he was back in the gym. And Coach was locking the door, but this time James couldn't move or speak, just stood there frozen while the tornado got closer. He said he felt guilty that he didn't confront Coach sooner, before we were locked in, that maybe if he'd stood up to Coach's behavior during regular practices, we never would have been in that situation. I reminded him that he saved our lives by standing up when he did, that grabbing my phone back from Coach and forcing the confrontation was the reason we got out in time. But he just shook his head and said he should have seen the warning signs earlier. All those times Coach got too intense or pushed us too hard, and he'd ignored it because he wanted his scholarship and didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't know what to say to make him feel better because part of me understood the guilt. We'd all seen signs and ignored them. Nina texted the group chat late that night with something she'd found while going through old social media posts. Coach Brennan's daughter had posted something 5 years ago on the anniversary of her hospitalization, and Nina had screenshot it. The post said, "Some people never learn that their dreams aren't worth other people's lives," and she'd tagged her father in it, but he'd never responded to it, or acknowledged it at all. The post was still up, public for anyone to see, and it felt like she'd been trying to warn people about him for years, but nobody had listened. I stared at those words on my phone screen, this message from a girl I'd never met who'd survived her own version of what we went through, and I felt this connection to her across time and distance, both of us damaged by the same man's inability to let go of winning. I spent 2 hours that night trying to figure out how to word a message to Coach's daughter. Every draft sounded wrong, either too formal or too casual, too demanding or too weak. Finally, I just wrote what was true. I told her I was on the team Coach locked in the gym during the tornado, that we were trying to understand what happened, and that her old post made me realize she'd been warning people about him for years. I hit send before I could overthink it more. She didn't respond that day, or the next day. By the third day, I figured she'd decided to ignore me, which I couldn't blame her for. Then my phone buzzed with a message from her account. Just one sentence. My father loved basketball more than he loved me, and he almost killed me trying to prove he was good enough. I read it 5 times, sitting on my bed with my phone shaking in my hands. That single sentence explained everything and nothing at the same time. Coach wasn't some evil person who wanted to hurt us. He was broken in a way that made him dangerous. Someone who kept trying to fix his own failures by winning through his teams. The tornado lockdown wasn't an isolated, crazy decision. It was just the most extreme version of something he'd been doing for 15 years. Every time he pushed too hard, every time he ignored safety or well-being, he was trying to prove something to himself that could never be proved by winning games. The pattern was so clear now that I couldn't believe we'd missed it. Or maybe we hadn't missed it. We'd just been too young to recognize what we were seeing. I forwarded the message to Faith and she called me within an hour. She'd been working on a follow-up article and wanted to include interviews with Coach's daughter and ex-wife if they'd agree. Both women said yes, apparently ready to tell their stories now that the criminal case was moving forward. The article came out 2 weeks later, and it changed everything. Faith wrote about Coach's mental health struggles, his daughter's hospitalization, his ex-wife's failed attempts to get him help. She included quotes from the sports psychologist about pathological fear of failure and how coaching culture makes it almost impossible for coaches to admit weakness. The comments section exploded. Half the people accused Faith of making excuses for someone who endangered children, saying mental illness doesn't give you permission to nearly kill people. The other half praised the article for showing how broken systems create dangerous situations, how schools pass problem coaches along instead of addressing issues, how winning gets valued over everything else. I read every comment, trying to figure out how I felt about it all. Then the court documents from Coach's criminal case became public, and we got the complete picture. He'd been diagnosed with depression and anxiety years ago, right after his daughter quit basketball. His ex-wife had found the paperwork while cleaning out their old house for the divorce. The records showed he'd gone to therapy for 6 months, got prescribed medication, seemed to be improving. Then he stopped everything, told his therapist he didn't need help anymore, that medication made him weak, that he could handle his problems by focusing on coaching. His ex-wife had begged him to go back to treatment. His previous schools had suggested counseling when his behavior got concerning. He refused every single time, convinced he could win his way out of his problems, that one state championship would prove he wasn't a failure and everything would be fine. Reading those documents made me so angry, but not at Coach anymore. I was angry at Lincoln High for hiring him without checking his history properly. Angry at his previous schools for giving him good references instead of honest ones. Angry at the coaching culture that made him think asking for help was weakness. Angry at every athletic director who saw warning signs and ignored them because his teams won games. My rage had been focused on one man who locked us in a gym, but now it spread out to include everyone who made that moment possible. The school board held a special meeting 6 weeks after Faith's article came out. Aditya had been pushing them hard on our lawsuit and they finally caved. They voted to settle for an amount they wouldn't tell us, but our lawyer said was substantial. More important, they passed new policies requiring mental health screenings for all coaches, mandatory reporting of concerning behavior to the state athletic board, and independent oversight of athletic departments. Jade stood up during the meeting and apologized directly to our team for the institutional failures that put us in danger. It felt like progress, but also kind of empty compared to what we'd been through. No amount of policy changes could undo the fact that we'd almost died. Coach's criminal trial wrapped up 2 months after the tornado. His lawyers worked out a plea deal, 2 years in prison followed by 5 years probation. He'd have to do mandatory mental health treatment and could never coach again or work with kids in any capacity. The judge read a long statement at the sentencing hearing about how mental illness explains behavior but doesn't excuse it, how Coach had responsibility for his choices even while struggling. I went to the sentencing with James, Danny, Maria, and Lily. We sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Coach shuffle in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He looked nothing like the intimidating figure who used to make us run sprints until we puked. He was thin and gray and looked about 20 years older than he actually was. When the judge asked if he wanted to speak, he stood up and started crying. He apologized to us, to his daughter, to everyone he'd hurt, said he knew sorry wasn't enough, but he wanted us to know he understood what he'd done. His voice cracked and broke and he could barely get the words out. I sat there listening and feeling absolutely nothing. His apology was probably real, but it didn't matter because it couldn't undo anything. After the judge finished and they led Coach away, we stood in the hallway outside the courtroom waiting for our parents. That's when Lily's mom rolled up to Coach's ex-wife, who was standing alone by the windows. We all went quiet, watching. They talked for maybe 2 minutes, voices too low for us to hear. Then Lily's mom reached up from her wheelchair, and Coach's ex-wife bent down and they hugged. Just stood there holding each other while people walked past them. Later in the car, Lily told me what her mom said during that conversation. We're both mothers who couldn't protect our children from him. Somehow that shared experience, both having kids hurt by the same person in different ways, created understanding between them. 6 weeks after the sentencing, our whole team met at the community center to decide what happened next. All 23 of us in one room for the first time since the tornado. Christopher had been fired as athletic director, and the new one wanted to know if we planned to play next season. We talked for 2 hours about what basketball meant to us now, whether we could separate the sport from the trauma, whether staying together made sense. The vote was unanimous. We were done with competitive basketball, all of us. The sport was too tangled up with what Coach did, with the tornado, with everything that happened after. But we wanted to stay connected as people, as the group who survived something terrible together and came out the other side changed. The settlement checks arrived 6 weeks after the school board vote, and Danny texted me a photo of his family standing in front of a small brick house 2 towns over, outside the tornado zone. His little sister was grinning in the doorway, and his grandparents looked tired but relieved in a way I'd never seen before. When I called him that night, he told me it was the first time his family had owned a home instead of renting or living in the trailer park. His voice got quiet when he added that he wished it hadn't taken almost dying to get there, but he was grateful for the stability his family finally had. 2 days later, the school board held a public meeting that all of us attended with our parents. They announced that Christopher Lane had been fired as athletic director after the investigation revealed he'd ignored multiple warnings about Coach and failed to properly verify his employment history before hiring him. The superintendent read a formal apology to our team and the community for the institutional failures that enabled everything that happened. Christopher sat in the back row during the announcement, staring at his hands and left through a side door before anyone could approach him. The assistant coach had already resigned weeks earlier, so the board's statement about him was brief and procedural. 3 months after the tornado, my phone buzzed with a text from Bailey that just said, "Can we talk?" I hadn't heard from her since she stopped responding to the group chat, and seeing her name on my screen made my stomach twist. We met at the coffee shop downtown, and she looked different. Calmer somehow, but also worn down. She apologized for withdrawing from the group and explained that she'd needed space to process everything alone before she could engage with it collectively. She said she was finally ready to be part of the team again, but not in the investigative capacity, just as someone who survived the same thing we all did. I hugged her and told her we were glad to have her back in whatever way worked for her. The next week, identical envelopes arrived at each team member's house with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from the assistant coach taking full responsibility for his silence and cowardice during everything that happened with Coach. He wrote that he was working at a hardware store now and said he'd never coach again because he didn't trust himself to speak up when it mattered most. His letter was 2 pages long, and you could see where the ink had smudged in places like he'd been crying while writing it. Some of us threw the letters away immediately, but I kept mine in my desk drawer and read it sometimes when I was trying to understand how good people stay silent during bad things. Faith called me in early April with news that she'd won a regional journalism award for her investigation into Coach and the systemic failures that enabled him. The ceremony was at a hotel conference center, and our whole team showed up to support her even though we weren't officially invited. During her acceptance speech, she credited us for having the courage to dig into painful truths when it would have been easier to just accept the surface explanation and move on. She announced that she was donating the entire prize money to a fund supporting mental health resources for student athletes. A week after Faith's award ceremony, Melanie Sutton drove 6 hours to visit our town and meet us in person. We gathered at the community center, and she spent the afternoon sharing stories about Coach's impact on her life and how she'd turned that experience into a career as a social worker specializing in sports trauma. She talked about the locker room incident from 6 years ago and how it had shaped her understanding of how power dynamics work in athletics. Listening to her describe her healing process made me realize that what happened to us was part of a much longer pattern, and we were just the point where it finally became impossible to ignore. 6 months after the tornado, our town held a memorial service for the 7 people who died, including the high school student who'd been caught in his car trying to get home. Our entire team attended together, standing in the back of the crowd while families placed flowers at a temporary monument in the town square. The students' parents spoke about their son's dreams of becoming an engineer, and a woman talked about her elderly mother who'd lived through 3 other tornadoes, but couldn't survive this one. Standing there reminded me that while we'd survived and found answers to our questions, 7 families would never get that closure. James got a recruiting call from a college basketball team in late spring, and I was with him when he turned them down over the phone. He told the recruiter that the sport was too connected to trauma now, and he needed a fresh start doing something completely different. Later, he showed me his college application essays about wanting to study education and become the kind of teacher who prioritizes student well-being over achievement and trophies. His dad was disappointed about the lost scholarship opportunity, but James seemed more at peace than I'd seen him since before the tornado. Lily, despite being our youngest player at 15 now, became an advocate for student safety in athletics, and somehow got invited to testify before the state legislature. I watched the hearing online and saw her sit at a table with a microphone, looking tiny but determined, as she described being 14 and trapped in that gym while the tornado approached. Her testimony helped pass new laws requiring independent oversight of high school sports programs and mandatory mental health support for coaches. Watching her speak so clearly about what happened made me proud and sad at the same time, because she shouldn't have had to become that strong that young. My family relocated over the summer to help with my recovery, and I started my senior year at a completely new school where nobody knew about the tornado or coach or any of it. I wasn't playing basketball anymore, but I joined the school newspaper on my first day and discovered I was actually good at investigative writing. Faith had become an informal mentor, sending me articles about responsible journalism and teaching me how to pursue truth without causing unnecessary harm to people who were already suffering. On the 1-year anniversary of the tornado, I drove to the rebuilt gym for our team gathering. The parking lot looked different now, all fresh asphalt instead of the cracked concrete we used to know. James was already there when I arrived, standing near the entrance looking taller somehow, even though he couldn't have grown. Lily showed up next with her mom, and then Danny pulled in with Bailey and Nina. We didn't all make it. Some people couldn't face coming back, but 17 of us gathered near the spot where the old gym used to stand. The new building behind us was smaller and simpler than before, built with the insurance money and community donations. We'd brought a young oak tree in a burlap sack and shovels from Danny's truck. Nobody really knew how to plant a tree properly, but we figured it out together, taking turns digging in the hard spring ground while others held the sapling steady. The plaque we'd ordered together sat propped against the building, bronze letters that read, "For the courage to question authority," and the strength to survive its failures. Maria helped me position it near the base of the tree once we'd tamped down the soil and watered everything. Looking around at everyone, I could see how we'd all changed in different ways. James seemed calmer but sadder. Lily stood straighter but startled at loud noises. Danny smiled less but hugged people more. Some of us were doing better than others, but none of us were the same kids who ran from that gym. I've spent this whole year trying to understand what happened and why, and the truth is messier than I wanted it to be. Coach Brennan was a broken person who got enabled by broken systems, and knowing that doesn't make me less angry, but it does help me aim that anger at fixing things, instead of just staying stuck in what already happened. Some questions don't have clean answers, and some damage doesn't fully go away. But I still think seeking truth matters even when it's complicated and painful. Life isn't about getting perfect closure or healing completely. It's about moving forward with whatever messy, incomplete understanding you've managed to earn along the way.